Hello, everyone. I would say it's lovely to see you, but I can't see any of you. But thank you for being here. It's really lovely to be back chatting on the Be Bold History Network. This talk this evening is going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. I offered to do this talk thinking, yes, I can do 40 minutes on the Pre-Reformation parish. And as I started writing it, I realised I had an enormous amount of things to say. And unfortunately, I can't go into all of the topics in great depth this evening, but I've prepared a reading list for everyone. So if there is something that piques your interest, hopefully you'll be able to go off and find a book or a magazine article or a podcast or something that you can, explore that area further. So I'm going to start today with, well, if you've been to one of my talks, you will have seen this quote before. One of my favourite quotes about the Pre-Reformation parish, and it's by the historian Eamon Duffy. And he says, if we can take it as the axiom of human nature that your money is where your heart is also, then the hearts of late medieval and early modern Tudor English men and women were in their parish churches. Now, to me, this really sums up the central importance of the parish and its church to ordinary people in their everyday lives. And the interaction that ordinary people had with the parish didn't just result from mandatory attendance at things like mass, visitations, court appearances, or tithe gatherings. Parishioners assembled in the parish church for a lot more than that. They assembled for family and neighbourhood baptisms, marriages, and funerals, but also parish fundraising activities, theatre productions and plays, building maintenance events, and all kinds of activity. And what we see happen in the 2 centuries before the Reformation, for a number of reasons that I'll go into in this talk, ordinary people start to pour money into their parish church. And that really shows us just how important and central it was in their everyday lives. Now, I'm sure you'll realise that actually this story couldn't be any further from the truth for the reality that is faced by parish churches today. And I was having a bit of a Google this week about parish church attendance, just out of interest to see, what was going on. And I came across this article from 2019. And it basically argued that for parish churches to remain relevant in today's society, and in some cases to even just remain open, they basically had to take the lead from cathedrals and diversify their offerings. So open up their spaces for activities other than worship, baptism, marriage, and funerals. And this got me thinking about 2 things, really. Firstly, how similar this situation was to what was happening in the Middle Ages. As I've just said, then parish churches did far more than just, house mass on a Sunday. But secondly, it also got me thinking about how the fortunes of the parish church have changed over time. The wonderful quote that I started with isn't reflective of the entire history of the parish church. The parish church did have a much humbler start than that, and it's only in the later Middle Ages that it really receives a lot of attention. So to start with, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the parish in context so that you're clear on where it is, in the church hierarchy and how it fits in. And we're going to have a look at some of the key developments that allowed it to become so important. So I'm going to start with possibly something that we all know, that the headquarters of the Western Church was based in Rome for most of the time. For most of the medieval period, the Pope was in Rome, and he is basically regarded as the successor of St. Peter. And I've got this lovely illustration on screen that shows Christ appointing St. Peter as the chief apostle and giving him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And then obviously the idea is that these keys and, the keys to the kingdom of heaven are inherited by St. Peter's successors in the form of the papacy. And there are a number of issues that face the papacy from their early years right through to the later Middle Ages, including the Great Schism, which happens in the 14th century. And this actually results at one time in there not being just one pope in Rome, but 3 separate popes elected at 3 separate locations in Europe. So it does get quite messy. And unfortunately, this isn't something I have time to go into today, but for the purposes of today's talk, we just need to remember that the Pope is usually in Rome, sometimes in Avignon, but that's basically the centre of Western Christendom. Now, the success of the medieval church as a dominant force can really be attributed to its highly developed organisation. And this becomes, over the course of the Middle Ages, a very sophisticated system of governance, law, and economy. And while the Pope is mostly based in Rome, he has got representatives who oversee huge territorial units throughout Western Europe. So immediately below the Pope in the church hierarchy, we've got the cardinals, or the princes of the church. And these men already held positions within the Western Church, usually as archbishops or bishops, and they were appointed to the College of Cardinals. And in the event of the Pope's death, it's these men who elect the next Pope, so it's a very important role. Then within individual countries, we have archdioceses or archbishoprics, which are overseen by an archbishop. And in England, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, we have something of a north-south divide with the Archbishopric of York up in sort of the northern half of England, and then the Archbishopric of Canterbury that's sort of the Midlands and the south. And then within these archdioceses, you have got individual dioceses which are overseen by bishops. And then right at the bottom of the hierarchy, as sort of, a smaller unit of these dioceses, we have the parish. So the parish church is the most basic unit of the Christian community, and its purpose is to provide the sacraments that are required by ordinary people. So for most medieval Christians, their religious experience was focused on the parish and the parish church, which they attended, at least in theory, because obviously there are exceptions, which we can discuss in the Q&A, on Sundays and other religious festivals. So alongside that hierarchy, with the parish, sitting at the bottom there, we also have a vast network of religious communities throughout Western Europe. And these communities consisted of men and women who had sworn vows of obedience, celibacy, and poverty. They lived in enclosed communities, so cut off from the world, and they were governed by a rule or a book of instructions. And the most influential and widespread rule in the Middle Ages was the Rule of St. Benedict, and that really set out a detailed routine consisting of manual labour, prayer, and study. And there are numerous religious orders. Some are stricter, others are more lenient across the Middle Ages. And actually, in the reading list, there's a fantastic little animated video by English Heritage that does a great job of explaining all the different religious orders, because it can be quite confusing. And broadly, we can categorize these religious communities and these religious orders into three groups. So you've got your monastic orders, so the monks and the nuns who are removing themselves as much as possible from their previous lives and living in communities that have minimal contact with the outside world. You've got your mendicant orders who were basically more engaged with ordinary people. They travelled about, they preached, they heard confession, and they relied on charity. And then you've got your militant orders, so things like your Knights Templar. So knights who participated in crusades, seeking to capture the Holy Land and convert Muslims and other faiths to Christianity. Now, monasteries and their other cognate forms are the building blocks of Western Christianity. And although the rate of foundation for these enclosed monastic communities does slow down from the 13th century onwards, it's really important to remember that these institutions survive throughout the later Middle Ages with remarkably few losses, and they do continue to fulfill a wide range of purposes and needs. And we also see the increase in the foundation of secular communities, so groups of priests or canons who lived together and worshipped together but had more contact with the outside world. There's some very famous foundations at places like Windsor, for example. And if this is something that piques your interest and you think we'd like to find a little bit more out about this side of medieval religion, I'm going to do a cheeky plug here for a project that I'm working on with the Milton Keynes City Discovery Centre around the site of Bradwell Priory or Bradwell Abbey, and we're developing lots of new exciting material for use in the classroom. So if you'd like to be involved or trial some resources or have a chat with me about that, please do get in touch. But as I mentioned at the start, the focus of today is the medieval parish. And the reason for this is because if you want to understand ordinary people and their motives and their beliefs and how they reacted to huge events like the arrival of the Black Death, then you need to understand their way of life. And to do that, you have to look at the parish. So how did the parish come about? Well, as I've said, it's the lowest part of this ecclesiastical sort of hierarchy, and it facilitated the basic teaching of the liturgy in the localities and it ensured the administration of the sacraments to ordinary people. Now, monasteries, nunneries and colleges, those religious communities on the other hand, they have very elaborate, sophisticated and continual liturgical services. They're often very richly endowed, and they set and maintain quite a high benchmark really of Christian worship and observance in England for the best part of a millennium. And this is why it's those institutions and not the parish at this point that really attracts, focus from the elite and the investment in these places. So basically we can think of as, these religious communities taking the center of the stage in the Middle Ages, and the parishes are forming the chorus line at the back, doing the high kicks and kind of keeping everyone out in the localities happy. They're not the principal players in the production yet. And parish churches were basically established, usually to either suit seigneurial convenience. So a lord would perhaps like a church near his manor house, for example, so he could conveniently worship there, or in towns and villages where neighbourhood communities struggled to make it to the Minster church and they wanted to worship at a more convenient location. So throughout sort of the high Middle Ages, we see these parish boundaries crystallising, and they become fixed by about the year 1200. And there are approximately 9,000 parish churches across England by the time we head into the later Middle Ages. And each of these parish churches supported a parish priest who had responsibility for all of the pastoral and sacramental duties in that area. But, as a single priest or a one-man show, these institutions, it seems like they're going to struggle to compete with what the monasteries and the nunneries are doing. And they're sort of perhaps the odd one out because, Christian aspiration at this point is best served by communal liturgical celebration, and that's fulfilled by those monasteries, nunneries and colleges. But what happens is we see, circumstances sort of conspire to thrust the parish and the parish church into the centre of the stage in the later Middle Ages. And something that I really would like to draw your attention to, and again, if you've been to one of my previous talks, you'll know that I go on about this a lot, but it's the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. And this really is something of a watershed moment in the life of the medieval parish. So the Fourth Lateran Council is convened by Pope Innocent III in Rome, and it's attended by more than 1,000 prelates from every part of Western Christendom. And this council is really important for a number of reasons that I'll discuss in a moment, but it also actually sets down Christianity, and by that I mean Roman Catholicism, as it's going to prevail under the Council of Trent in 1545 to 63. Now, the intention of this council was to bring the divine down to earth by redirecting the efforts of the church so that it can function more effectively, but so that it can also assist all of the faithful, so not just the wealthy and the elite who can, invest in monasteries to have lots of prayers said for them and things. And the council issues a number of canons against heresy and superstition. It sets standards concerning clerical selection, education and discipline, and it also imposes obligations on ordinary parishioners. So most notably the fact that every Christian of age had to go and make confession at least once a year. It's also at the Fourth Lateran Council that the teachings of transubstantiation are defined. So it's officially decided at this point that the bread and wine offered in the sacrament of the Eucharist actually become the blood and the body of Christ. And anyone who teaches the Reformation will know how much of a hot topic that becomes later on. Another significant development which comes out of the Fourth Lateran Council is the increasing responsibility of the parishioners for the nave of their parish church. So on the diagram you've got on screen, you can see the nave is that central portion of the church, and that's where parishioners would stand and hear the mass and hear all the other religious services. So it was decided that it's the parish's responsibility to maintain the nave and the churchyard, and also to supply the required liturgical items. So that included things like mass books, candlesticks and chalices. So they needed to make sure that the church was a place worthy of, the host and honouring God. And they just needed to make sure everything was in good repair. So, if you had a leak in the ceiling that was above the nave, then that was the parishioner's responsibility. And then the clergy, meanwhile, are looking after the chancel, which is that smaller section off to the right. And these two areas are separated by what's called a rood screen. Now, by the time we get to the 14th century, the laity have really organised themselves so that they can raise and spend money effectively to keep the nave and its contents in good repair. And what's interesting is that while these statutes lay out the minimal requirements of care that the parishioners, need to ensure are in place, there's no maximum requirements. And what we see happening in the later Middle Ages is parishioners going above and beyond what is required, to the extent that these churches become filled with pious gifts, devotional aids, and liturgical props that are all needed for the parishioners' spiritual health. And to do all of this, they really needed to have a dedicated fund so that they could keep the money together somewhere safe. And the sort of emergence of this fund and this process of looking after the nave leads to an office called Church Warden, which still exists today. And these church wardens are men who are very well known and respected in the local area, and they basically oversee the laity's responsibility in the parish church. Now, at the same time as these sort of various decrees that are coming out of the Fourth Lateran Council, of course, we also have purgatory becoming a much more developed and embedded concept. And purgatory, for anyone who isn't sure, is this sort of waiting room between heaven and hell. So the idea is that, only if you committed a mortal sin, if you murdered someone, would you go straight to the fiery gates. And only if you were a saint, and I mean like quite literally a saint, as in you could perform miracles, would you go straight to heaven. Everyone else would spend some time in purgatory atoning for the various sins that they'd committed during their lifetime. And what's really interesting is that purgatory only features in passing in the church's ministrations at the deathbed, but it looms really, really large in lay awareness. And it provides this underlying rationale for, giving lots of money to the parish church, for the cult of intercession of the dead. So it's a very, very topical, tangible thing that people are reminded of and are aware of on a daily basis. And late medieval men and women are really quite well informed about the pains that they may experience in purgatory. There are lots of colourful depictions that are offered in sermons. You've got works such as More's Supplication of the Souls, and of course lots of lovely images on the inside of the parish churches. Sadly, most of those don't survive today. And really the prognosis for sinners was far from encouraging, as this quote from Eamon Duffy highlights. And he says how visitors to purgatory saw souls in every posture of physical torment, suspended by meat hooks, driven through jaws, tongue, or sexual organs, frozen into ice, boiling in liquid metal or fire. Often the punishment was carefully matched to the crime. The sexually promiscuous were tormented in the loins, the gluttonous forced to drink scalding venom or nauseous filth. The backbiters and liars had their tongues or lips sliced away. So you can see it's not really somewhere that you'd want to spend any amount of time. But it was believed that through a lifetime of observant piety, and then obviously the deathbed ministrations of the church, that even the most sort of half-hearted medieval Christian had a chance for salvation. And so what happens is it's purgatory rather than hell that becomes the focus of fear, because there was this idea that, as long as you didn't commit a mortal sin, there's a chance you're going to make it to heaven at some point, and salvation really was achievable. There are a number of ways that you could potentially shorten the amount of time that you may end up in purgatory. And this was generally through, prayer, works of penance, almsgiving, and securing masses for your soul when you eventually did, depart from this life. And people were urged really to get all of these kind of good works organised and off to a good start while they were in good health, and not leave things to the last minute. So it's really this idea of preparing your soul for the afterlife. And something called the corporal works of mercy really became quite an important focal point for medieval people. And I've got a lovely illustration on screen that's actually from the mid-16th century. And if you go around anti-clockwise, you can see the different sort of works of mercy being carried out. So you've got things like feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, burying the dead, which is a slightly unusual one. We'll come back to that. providing shelter for the stranger, you know, clothing the naked. So things that we would still very much recognise as charitable acts today. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to burying the dead, because I imagine, I mean, I could be wrong, please tell me in the chat if you disagree, but I imagine that burying the dead, we don't really see that as, you know, a charitable act. You know, we think more about, you know, providing food and water and shelter for people and clothing and education. But in the Middle Ages, actually providing someone with a proper burial was a real act of charity. And just, you know, hold on to that thought as we go through the rest of this talk, because it's going to become increasingly important later on. So what happens in the later Middle Ages is we see, you know, these motives for shortening the amount of time that you may spend in purgatory and the responsibility that parishioners had for looking after the nave colliding. And the maintenance of the parish church and the provision of its furniture and its ornaments become really a principal expression of penitential practice. And in the 2 centuries before the Reformation, we see individuals, groups, including parish guilds, and the parish community in its entirety pouring money into their churches. And from the records, we can see that gifts were made during people's lifetimes, but also after death, with various bequests in wills. And these bequests could include things like money, you know, quite a practical provision. Also things, you know, like I've listed on screen from a fabulous inventory we have from a church in Laos in Lincolnshire. You know, you've got things like silver crosses, silver chalices, a silver box to hold incense, candlesticks, books, this kind of thing. But also people gave more interesting things, sheep, cattle, timber, crops, so wheat, rye and beans, bushels of malt, loads of stone, particularly if there's a building project going on, beehives, barrels of salt and fish, things like jewellery and rings, items of clothing, so lots of silk gowns and satin gowns. And what happens is by the end of the 14th century, even the most obscure village church is fully equipped, and it's largely through, you know, these gifts that are given by ordinary people. Now, another important factor that really sort of helps the parish church is the foundation of chantries and chantry chapels. And chantry chapels were a great way to shorten the amount of time you would spend in purgatory, because they basically guaranteed you extra prayers for your soul. So what we see is that, you know, corporate intercession for the dead, so prayers for the deceased, are quite highly formalised and highly regulated. Most funerals take a very similar format and the same provisions are made. So there is this sort of basic provision that's made for you, but if you want to go a step further, then you might leave behind some money in your will to establish a chantry. And I've got a beautiful example of a chantry chapel up on screen for you. And these chantries, oh, I've got a message on my screen. These chantries could be perpetual or they could be temporary in nature. It sort of depended on how much money you had to spare. And it, as I said, it involved regular prayers for the benefit of the soul of the founder, but also usually for his family as well. And these chantries usually would come with either cold hard cash or an endowment of land, which could be used to then raise money so that the parish could pay for the services of an additional priest. Because as you could imagine, the parish priest who is busy looking after everyone and doing all the basic stuff wouldn't then have time to do all these additional prayers and services. And from the late 14th century onwards, we see the number of these chantry chapels increase in their number. And this has a marked impact on the finances and the staffing levels in the parish. I mean, in some smaller parishes, you end up with several additional parish priests, which is fantastic, you know, for all the other types of activity and liturgical service they can offer. So when we take all of these factors together, the parishioner's responsibility for the nave of the church, this increasing looming presence of purgatory and people's desire to provide for their souls through intercessory prayer and good works, we can see how the parish church really becomes a focal point for people, particularly in a period, you know, after the Black Death, where you have got increasing per capita wealth. So, you know, for the first time, a lot of people actually have money that they can spend on things other than their own subsistence. And so, you know, as well as these parish churches being served by a plurality of priests as a result of chantry foundations, they're also often enlarged, rebuilt in some cases. They're really sumptuously equipped and flamboyantly decorated. And these parishioners are, you know, they're taking their obligations to the nave of the parish church, you know, way beyond what was ever expected of them. And hundreds of the parish churches that survive from this period are, you know, absolutely stunning. And they are beautiful examples of perpendicular style. And those ones that are sort of constructed or remodeled in the later Middle Ages are, you know, some of the best examples we have of medieval parish churches. And I've got one of the examples for you on the screen now, but, you know, there's absolutely hundreds of them, and they are beautiful. And all of this work is the result of ordinary men and women. Now, the importance of the exterior of the parish church really cannot be overstated, because it's displaying an identity or an image to everyone outside, you know, so not just the people in the parish, but visitors and you know, people coming from other locations. And it demonstrates the spiritual health and the material wealth of that community, because they've got the money to invest in the parish church, and, you know, they're doing this for the benefit of everyone's souls. And it's really important to note that the construction or the reconstruction of England's parish churches require great achievements in art and architecture, but also in organisation and finance. Because while cathedrals and abbeys can draw on substantial landed wealth for their building projects, and, you know, payments from nobles and earls and people, parishes actually depend on a much more varied and unpredictable source of income. And so in order to achieve these great feats, they really needed the collaboration of the whole parish, even if this was, you know, strictly ordered by status and sometimes excluded certain members. But it's this collective contribution from the whole community of parishioners and the careful management and oversight of the church wardens that allows for these wonderful projects to happen. And I do have a favourite example, and again, if you've been to any of my talks, I'm sorry, you will have heard of this one, but my favourite example of one of these late medieval parish churches that was partially rebuilt in this period is the Church of St James in Laos in Lincolnshire. And what I've got on screen for you now is the moment that the church spire is completed, and there's a wonderful celebration. And this is recorded by a gentleman called John Cawood, who is not only the choir master at the church, but he's also the organist and the scribe. So he keeps the church warden's accounts. And he records, you know, how the bells are rung by the church wardens, the priests, you know, performing various religious services, there's bread and ale, you know, the people are celebrating. It's a huge achievement. And when this church spire is completed, and you can see it on your screen now, it stands at 295 feet. So it's actually the tallest medieval parish church spire in England. It is stunning. And it took 15 years to build. The whole project cost just over £305. And in today's money, that's roughly £200,000. And you have to remember, this is a time when you didn't get a mortgage or a loan to do this kind of work. The parishioners had to raise that money. And we can see from the surviving accounts that £178 of that total came directly from the church wardens, and they transferred the money into the building accounts. But the remainder of the money comes from the parish community, primarily facilitated by the Parish Guilds, but also from individual members in the community as well. And this really highlights the community effort, you know, and this is happening across the country. People are really invested in their parish church. And it's not just the exterior that people care about, it's also the interior and what goes on inside. You know, parishioners are really keen to enhance their liturgical experience. And in the 14th and the 15th centuries, as a result of, you know, people's increased wealth, which means they can give more to the parish church, and also the increased number of priests who are available and employed in the parish churches, we see that actually parish churches begin to emulate the really complex liturgical arrangements which previously had been the reserve of these religious communities that I discussed earlier, the monasteries and the nunneries. And, you know, again, taking my favourite example of Laos, we know that for there, the community came together to purchase not one, but two brand new organs in the early 16th century. They also have a very active choir with a regular choir master and organ player. And they've also got some really musically competent chaplains who are sort of, you know, copying music and things like that. So across the country, we see that parish churches are investing in music, instruments and singers, showing that it's no longer just these enclosed religious communities who are enjoying, you know, complex liturgical arrangements or polyphonic music. And really, the reason that the parish is so successful, as I've said, is because it is inclusive. You don't have to have lots of money. You can give what you can afford to be involved in these processes. And that perhaps explains why, when we compare with other institutions in the late Middle Ages, that the parish really benefits from such a degree of sustained investment from so wide a spectrum of participants. And when the new spire at St James's Church was built in Laos, we see donations coming, corporately from the guilds, but also from individuals, so wealthy merchants who would give £5 in gold, but also, manual labourers who would give a few pennies. Late medieval religion is corporate, and it's really focused on this communal sense of seeking salvation. What is good for the community is also good for you, that sort of idea. And as I've said, the parish church does far more than just house the liturgy and provide a place for the sacraments. It is the heart of the community, and it plays a real central role in people's lives throughout the year, not just on Sundays. Now, punctuating the year of Sunday services, which is obviously a day that we would normally associate with going to church, in the medieval period, we've also got a whole range of holy days and saints' days that commemorate the life of Jesus and the martyrdom of the saints. So along with formal celebrations on these days, additional masses and services, parishioners would also celebrate with processions, pageantry, plays, ales and revels, all of which took place in and around the parish church. There were 52 saints' days throughout the year, which basically allow people to have time off work to worship the saint, and also to engage in some of these other activities. And everywhere you looked in late medieval England, you were reminded of this cult of saints. Their images are carved into drinking cups and bowls. Children are given their names at baptism. Their images are filling the inside of parish churches. They're, above individual altars. They're absolutely everywhere. And in medieval religion, saints acted as exemplars of good Christian values, and they also acted as intercessors between ordinary people and God. So it's believed that in return for worshipping the saint, they would look after you and they would protect you. And they might even perhaps, if you went on pilgrimage to their shrine, perform a miracle. And we know that saints are particularly loved and trusted in the Middle Ages because ordinary people leave bequests to them in their wills. So things like having candles put before the image of a saint, maintaining masses at the saint's altar in the parish church, or even commissioning pilgrimages to the saint's shrine. And we see that there are important local saints as well as the national cults, and also saints that are actually linked to particular crafts and trades. And from the 14th century onwards, what we see happen is this sort of voluntary devotion to the saints actually starts to take a corporate form, and that is expressed in the foundation of a parish guild. So parish guilds, also called brotherhoods, fraternities or confraternities in the documents, are basically groups of men and women who come together under the patronage of a particular saint to offer additional worship and religious services. And the central purpose of the guilds is to provide all of their members the proper funeral and to regularly perform masses for the souls of the deceased. Now, you'll remember that when we were talking about those works of mercy, burying the dead was really seen as a very charitable act. It's something that can shorten the amount of time you would spend in purgatory. So guilds are offering that to all of their members. They're also offering, lots of intercessory masses to be said for your soul. So in many ways, this allows for the democratization of the Chantry system that I talked about earlier, because really that was the reserve of the elite and those who could afford to leave a lump of money or land. But as well as offering these services, they also hold regular meetings. They stage an annual feast to honour the patron saint. They also do things like, pay for repairs to be made in the parish church, or in the case of Laos, contribute to building costs. And they also provide charity for destitute members, in the form of providing food, water, shelter and clothing. It's been estimated that by the time we get to the later Middle Ages, there are approximately 30,000 of these associations across England. So if you consider that there are 9,000 parish churches, we can confidently say that there are at least one, probably many more parish guilds attached to each church. And these guilds were really instrumental in enriching the liturgy, providing funds for the aggrandizement or the maintenance of a parish church, and also in organising local festivals and feasts on saints' days. And without the support of these institutions, actually, many of these local parish events and activities just simply would not have happened. So when we're looking at the pre-Reformation parish, we also need to look at the involvement of the parish guilds. And a really important point to remember is these associations are voluntary. You don't have to join them, but people choose to. Ordinary men and women, they choose to join these associations, to pay a membership fee, which could range from a few pence to a few shillings, to abide by specific rules and regulations, some of which are, by modern standards, really quite bizarre. And also to take part in, central guild activities, including things like the feast and the charitable acts. So guilds are really important in this cult of saints that we have in the later Middle Ages. And as I've said, throughout the liturgical year, you've got approximately 52 saints' days, which are celebrated, some with greater reverence than others. And the liturgical year starts with Advent, so the 4 weeks leading up to Christmas, something which we still celebrate today with chocolate calendars. And then obviously you have Epiphany at the end of the 12 days of Christmas. Easter is the most important point in the liturgical calendar. And then following Easter, parishes would celebrate things including Whitsun and Corpus Christi. And then in the wake of nationalistic sentiment, which comes out of the 100 Years' War, several new saints' days are added, including that of St. George, which of course we still recognise today. And parishioners use this liturgical calendar and this sort of, this cyclical range of saints' days to really articulate the relationship between themselves and the wider world. Because along with obviously the message of salvation and lots of prayers and masses, these feast days give parishes an opportunity to express their community identity. And a lot of the celebrations that we see on these saints' days are really ordered along status and gender lines. And so everyone who's watching or participating knows their relationship within the community and also the relationship between the community and the outside world. So it's really important for that sort of identity building. Now, the most common and affordable way to celebrate a saint's day was a feast. Usually this consisted of bread and ale, and it increasingly becomes an activity that is linked to parish guilds. The annual feast for a guild really had a purpose which was threefold. Firstly, obviously, to worship the saint, and you'll find in the documents that prayers were said at various points throughout the feast, sometimes before opening a particular barrel of wine or something like that. Secondly, it encouraged fraternity amongst the guild members, and a sense again of this community and this shared identity. It offered people an opportunity to socialise, to extend contacts for business transactions to be carried out, things like that. But also importantly, it allowed members to engage again in these corporal works of mercy. So there's a charitable function to these feasts as well, because poor people would be considered the poor people of the parish. So whether that is distributing bread and ale to the poor parishioners or actually inviting them to join them at the guild feast. So that these occasions provide lots of opportunities for guild members and parishioners to engage in good works to lessen the amount of time they would potentially spend in purgatory. Another really interesting aspect of parish life, which increasingly again is facilitated by the guilds, are all kinds of processions, plays and pageants. I should say at this point that these terms, plays, processions, pageantry, they are used interchangeably in the documents and they can be a little bit difficult to disentangle. So, in one parish, a procession might actually involve several pageants being carried on wooden poles or pushed on wheels, but in another parish, they would refer to this as a play. But either way, these activities are based on biblical stories and the lives of saints, and they're very didactic in nature, and they really become a significant part of the parish repertoire. And what's interesting is that research in the last 10 to 20 years has shown that the major locus for the performance of religious drama isn't in the big cities. Perhaps you've heard of the big religious cyclical plays in places like York and Coventry. And actually what research is finding is that it's the parish where a lot of this is happening too. And the scale of these processions and these pageants and plays obviously depended greatly on the financial resources of that individual parish, and also the assistance that was available from the parish guilds. So in some cases, you've got Corpus Christi plays that contain 11 different pageants that are moved around and performed by the guild members. But in other cases, it's something much simpler. So it's a procession to the church, perhaps with flowers and singing and candles and maybe occasionally dancing as well. And one of the most important days in the liturgical year in terms of this pageantry and these processions is Corpus Christi. And again, unfortunately, this is something I don't have time to delve into today, but there are suggestions on the reading list. And again, cheeky plug, I have got a chapter coming out about Corpus Christi Guilds in the near future. So what we can see from all this activity is that the relationship between the saints and the parishioner is really well established in the late Middle Ages. Parishioners might pray to the saint, light candles before their image, attend matins, mass and evensong on the feast days, and also probably join a parish guild. But if you wanted to go even further, if you really wanted to go above and beyond, in order to worship your saint and perhaps get a miracle in return and really sort of earn those brownie points to lessen your stay in purgatory, then you would consider going on a pilgrimage. And pilgrimages to holy places really enable people to obviously atone for their sins and again, shorten that stay in purgatory, to seek miraculous cures. And again, a lot of the pilgrimage literature around shrines and relics talks about this. But also really extended people's experience of the world. Now, it's the relics that people want to see. So those are the bodily remains of the saints or the objects that are associated with them. So it could be a piece of clothing that they wore, for example. And these are really the star attractions. And pilgrims could travel relatively short distances to see and touch the shrines of local saints, or they could undertake more ambitious journeys. So the most popular destinations in the later Middle Ages were Rome, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, apologies if I've butchered that pronunciation, I don't speak Spanish, Jerusalem in the Holy Land, and also Canterbury. And right up until, pilgrimages are outlawed, these remain popular destinations. And I've got a lovely extract on screen for you here, which just really describes how important pilgrimages were in the late Middle Ages. And this is describing, the pilgrimage route to Canterbury. And it says that ordained and lay, poor and rich, commoners and nobles, fathers and mothers with children, lords with their households, all went there, drawn by the same spirit of devotion. So again, you've got that same cross-section of the parish being involved in that activity. And often parishioners would group together to go on these pilgrimages. We have examples in Lincoln of parish guilds actually raising funds for parishioners to go on pilgrimage and seeing them off from the city gates. So again, it's quite a collective communal activity. Now, just keeping an eye on the time, I'm aware that I'm approaching kind of my 40 minutes. I'm going to try and briefly sum up. Again, I know I've thrown a lot at you, so thank you for bearing with me. As I've mentioned, there is a handout which has got suggested further reading. So if you want to delve into any of these topics in greater detail, please do, or feel free to message me, that's absolutely fine. But I just wanted to end with some final thoughts about medieval religion and the parish and how our views on these topics have changed over time. So traditionally, it has been argued that the late medieval church was failing, that it was in a state of decay, that it was corrupt, that people didn't understand the services because they were always in Latin, and that when these new Lutheran ideas came from Europe, people were really happy and excited and totally willing to accept them because they'd had enough. We also had this concept that the medieval church held everything back. Science and medicine stood completely still, and there's this sort of dark age, which is then contrasted by, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. But this has obviously not been the view that's been held by historians for the past 30 odd years. So, we're talking the entirety of my lifetime. The narrative has shifted quite a lot. For a start, the Renaissance actually is medieval. It starts in the 14th century, which I think we can all safely agree is the Middle Ages. So there is that. But then, of course, you've got these wonderful revisionist historians, so Eamon Duffy, who I've quoted quite a lot in this talk, but also Clive Burgess, who have led the way in breaking down these old assumptions about the medieval church and the Reformation. And, scholars today are going on to continually prove how dynamic, how progressive, and how engaged medieval people were. I mean, yes, of course, they lived by a different set of values and beliefs than those that we have today, but it doesn't mean that it was backward or a dark age. It's just different. It is just different. And we need to really understand the medieval mindset and kind of, put ourselves in those shoes and think, well, they had this set of beliefs. This was their world. That is why they reacted in that way to X, Y, and Z. So, it's so important to understand ordinary people's experience. And to do that, you need to understand the parish. And that will really help, when you teach any medieval topic. And I say that as someone who has taught at university, if you're teaching the impact of the Black Death or medicine through time, or even the Reformation itself, then you need to understand what medieval people believed and why. And then you can see how this affected their daily lives and why they took the actions that they did.
Can we kind of truly understand the medieval era, the Middle Ages, without really understanding the impact of religion and the role of the parish church?
No, in a word. No. Someone has asked this to me before, because obviously, this is my special area, and someone said to me, are we over-egging it a bit with the importance of religion? And I mooted that with, a colleague the other day, and she was just like, absolutely not. Like, it's central. It would be like trying to teach the 21st century without mentioning the internet. Like, you can't do it. It informs politics, it informs the economy, how society is run, rules and regulations around behavior, social codes. You need to understand medieval religion to understand what is going on in ordinary people's lives, but also in politics, because, again, it's something I haven't had a chance to go into, but politics and the church are so closely interwoven. You think when John's messing around with Magna Carta, like, how does he get out of it? Well, he gets the Pope to intervene, and when he doesn't, a few years earlier, when he doesn't do what the church wants, the whole country's excommunicated. So the two are really closely interwoven, and you can't understand one without the other. It underlies everything in the Middle Ages. And that is why when we get to the Reformation, that is so dramatic. That's such a dramatic change for people, because it's an entire way of life. And it's a way of life that's been in place since the 6th century, since the Augustinian mission that's sent over by Gregory the Great. It's been in place for a long time. So no, in a word, no, you need to understand. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. That's fantastic. So then, in terms of sort of touching on the Reformation, as you just have, would kind of improving our knowledge, our understanding of the pre-Reformation parish, would that really help us and our students understand just how dramatic the Reformation really was?
Yes, because I think, again, it's tricky because, it is so distant in the past. The sources aren't always that accessible, and it's not like watching a film of, I don't know, the First World War trenches or something. It can seem a bit distant, and not everywhere has these beautiful monastic ruins where we can go, oh, the dissolution of the monasteries. So yeah, you really need to understand the impact it had on ordinary people, because we do focus on the dissolution of the monasteries, and that is catastrophic. But often we don't teach about the dissolution of the Chantrys, which happens a little bit later, and that affects all of the parish guilds. And as I was saying, those parish guilds are central, not just to the parish church, but to the running of entire towns and villages. It's an entire structure that is destroyed within the space of a few years. And I think, because we can't go in and see what the medieval churches would have looked like in their heyday, because they've all been, whitewashed, we can't imagine, even visually, like, those churches were full of images and shrines. And there was a real fear as well, so the decision is made overnight that the purgatory doesn't really exist. You don't need to worry about that. But that's a belief system that's been in place for so long. People are genuinely worried about the souls of their relations. Like, what if poor old dad is still, like, spending time in purgatory for his gambling habit? Like, what do I do? I'm told I'm not allowed to pray for his soul. You can't switch people's beliefs like that. And so I think it's so important to teach, about the parish and how people experienced everyday life, so that when these changes came along, we can really understand, how hard-hitting they were, and how, in many cases, how catastrophic they were as well.
Okay, thank you again for that answer. It's brilliant. So I'm just going to hand over to Sam, as I can see the Q&A is blowing up and we're getting loads of questions through. So I'll hand over to Sam now to go through some of those questions.
Great, thanks, John. Yeah, it is filling up. No pressure, Claire. So there's a lot of questions coming in, actually, and some really good, thoughtful questions. So we'll get through as many of them as we can. Thank you very much. So first of all, I think just because we've probably spoken about it already, Laura asks, how did the idea of hell, and I guess in the same token, purgatory, how did that affect people's everyday lives?
Well, purgatory is constantly on people's mind. Like, it's purgatory rather than hell that they focus on. Unless you're planning on committing a mortal sin, like a murder, you wouldn't go straight to hell. You would end up in purgatory. And so that means you do have a chance of salvation, but you're going to spend quite a long time actually in purgatory. And as I said, you know, people were aware of how horrible purgatory was. I mean, it basically sounds like hell. You're literally being tortured for your sins for a long period of time. And there would have been imagery on the church walls. It would have been referenced in sermons. You know, it's very much embedded in people's consciousness. And that is why we see all of these, you know, these penitential practices like giving lots of money to the parish church, joining the guild so you can worship the saints. So it's absolutely, it is on people's minds a lot, definitely.
And I think kind of linked to that, Terence has asked the question that first of all, he says, thanks very much for a great talk, and I'd echo that.
Hi, Terence, that's okay. I know Terence, sorry.
But there's also kind of linked to that, I think, in that, what are your views on the medieval parish's role in law and order? And as I say, I guess those two are kind of linked together.
Yeah, so what's really interesting is you have to remember that in the Middle Ages, there isn't a police force. So a lot of kind of law and order, you've obviously got church courts and things, and you know, that the whole sort of roaming justices and things, it develops under Henry II. That's one of his great legacies. And you do have access to church courts and to other royal courts. But what really regulates people's behaviour is this sort of sense of reputation in the local area, and you know, being the person who is doing all the good works and being seen to do the good works. And your reputation is of the utmost importance in the parish, because you know, if you tarnish your reputation, you could basically be ostracised. And there are lots of cases of things like slander that are brought before church courts and other courts as well, where people feel that their reputations have been called into question for various reasons. So as well as having your church sort of systems that were, you know, not really done at parish level, but a bit higher up, normally sort of overseen at more sort of diocese level, in the local community, there were sort of unspoken norms and regulations that would have codified behaviour and would have, you know, deemed what was acceptable. A bit like today. I mean, we still have that kind of, you know, you want to be seen behaving a certain way. We know it's not appropriate to go out and get drunk and swear at people in the middle of the day on the high street. It's a similar thing in the Middle Ages, and reputation is so important, and entire lives could be destroyed by someone, you know, claiming that you had done something wrong. So I would say, you know, the parish, and also don't forget guilds had rules and regulations as well, and some of them were quite interesting. Like, you know, if a member was found to be sort of wandering the streets or gambling late at night, like they could be thrown out of the guild. And the guild is the main way that you're going to get access to political power in the parish. So it's all these kind of, you know, these lesser rules and regulations that aren't necessarily enforced by the government or a police force, but, you know, there is your reputation to consider, and there is your place in the parish. And if you want to climb that parish hierarchy, which most people did, you know, they wanted to be church warden or guild alderman, you're not going to do that if you are known as a local drunkard or a gambler, or, you know, you're having affairs left, right and centre. So there is that pressure to conform. And also there is, you know, this constant awareness that there's purgatory, and you don't want to end up there for longer than you need to be by committing minor sins, which could include things like gossiping. You know, gossiping was, you know, you'd end up in purgatory for a bit for that. So, yeah.
And Paul's asked a question that, again, I think links in quite well here, where he's asked about the kind of role in the parish church in enforcing religious uniformity, specifically in regards to things like heresy or irreligion. So does it play a role there too?
Do you know, I was going to talk a little bit about heresy, and I realised I'd gone over my 40 minutes when I was practicing this talk. So heresy is an interesting one, and obviously, you know, it's something the church battles against at all levels. With Lollardy, it's interesting, but it's not widespread. You get little pockets of it that pop up and that affect certain parishes. So actually, you know, where I'm based, I know was a Lollard hotspot in the late 14th, early 15th centuries. Places like Amersham as well, they have little pockets of Lollardy. But what happened, the reason that Lollardy never really takes off is actually because it becomes very linked with the idea of insurrection and treason. So after the Great Revolt of 1381, obviously it becomes linked to rebellious behaviour. And then you've also got the Oldcastle Rebellion, which fails catastrophically in 1415. And, you know, when he's kind of basically hunted down as an outlaw, it drives the entire movement underground. So it never takes off in the same way that it does in, you know, with the Hussites in Bohemia. So it's never a real threat. And I know a lot of people kind of refer to it as proto-Protestantism. And I wouldn't say it's even that, because they're not wanting to do away with absolutely everything. They're wanting to reform the church. And that's a different argument than setting up, you know, basically a different version of Christianity. So I think we need to be a little bit careful there that we don't overplay that. I think Bristol as well is another Lollard hotspot. So you do have instances in parishes where it pops up, but again, it's stamped out quite quickly and effectively. And then as soon as it's linked to treason, everyone stays away.
And again, another very well linked question. Thank you ever so much, everyone on this call. You're linking in your questions beautifully. So Elliot has asked about Lollardy specifically, but specifically about that type of Lollardy that's denying the efficacy of intercessionary prayer. So, and they ask, has that had any impact on giving to churches and chapels in the 14th, 15th century?
No. No. Sorry, in a short answer. No, it really doesn't. I mean, right up until the point of the Reformation, ordinary people are really still investing in their churches and in chapels and in parish guilds. You know, it's right up until that last moment where everything suddenly is outlawed that people are investing. There's no slowdown in investment. I mean, you see sort of peaks and troughs throughout the later Middle Ages, but that tends to be more to do with sort of how the economy is doing rather than anything else. So no, it doesn't have an impact.
Cool, thank you. Still loads of questions coming in, so thank you ever so much. Keep those coming in. We'll keep getting through as many as we can. Oliver has just asked 2 questions, actually. In fact, 3 questions, and we'll come to them in turn, if that's okay. He just asked, firstly, besides church wardens' accounts and wills, are there any good source material that we could use to give voice to the voiceless, i.e. ordinary people at the parish church level?
Right, so what I would say about with wills is, first of all, is you need to be very careful with wills. We need to remember that actually ordinary people, you know, like your ordinary workers, they wouldn't have made a will because they wouldn't have been able to afford it. So it tends to be sort of, you know, the wealthier, the elite craftsmen, your merchants, and then obviously, you know, gentry and those sort of people. Also, married women couldn't make wills, so it's widows who can make wills. So, you know, it's a small fraction of society that we get to glimpse through wills, but they are really useful. In terms of ordinary people, really useful is if they survive. Again, there's an issue of, you know, if it survives. Things like guild account books. So they keep lists of members who join and their professions, and you can sort of trace them through various documents. Some court records as well. But again, there's an issue of, you know, to join a guild or to take a case to court, you have to have a certain amount of money. So, you know, if you're talking about people right at the bottom of the social spectrum, then unfortunately it is quite quiet. I mean, occasionally they pop up in passing reference, but it can be quite hard to trace them. One interesting group of people that we get a lot of documents for in this period are the merchants, the emerging merchant class, and they really are keen on the parish church. We have a whole, you know, there's a whole development of a thing known as the Merchant Tower, where they get excited about building these Western spires and things. But yeah, for anyone much further down the spectrum, it is hard. It is hard in the Middle Ages, I'm afraid.
Just so everyone's aware, obviously we've got lots of questions coming in, and thank you so much. We will get through as many of them as we can, but we're going to shoot for, I think, probably finishing about 8:10, just to give everyone an evening. So a question I think that's come in that is very interesting, actually, especially given what I know you've spoken to John about in regards to kind of medicine through time and linking that with the history of Middle Ages, but especially religion. Eve asks, Do you think that this, and by this I assume, Eve, that you mean what's going on in the parish church and indeed the broader kind of church organisation, does it halt scientific development? Or if it doesn't halt it, to what extent does it delay perhaps scientific development?
I think we need to be careful, because whenever we talk about scientific development, we're thinking, like modern technology and test tubes and all that kind of stuff. That obviously does not exist in the Middle Ages. What does happen in the Middle Ages, which is really interesting, is we get a lot of the texts being transcribed and translated and traveling across Europe. So we get an increase of knowledge from a much wider field that does have an impact on people's understanding of the body and how it works. The whole system of medieval medicine, and again, there's a lot of people I can point you to discuss medieval medicine who are absolutely fantastic, it's completely different to our modern concept. So your physician wouldn't really have prodded and poked you and done much of that. You would have your surgeons who would do that. And you didn't want your physician, who wasn't a hands-on craftsman, to deal with a cataract in your eye. Ideally, you would want a tailor to do that, because he had a very good, he could use a needle really well. It's a completely different system. And there are cases of dissection and trying to understand the human body. Recently, for a program I did, the Bone Detectives on Channel 4, they actually uncovered what they thought was the first dissection of a human body, and they were exploring the spine. So people are, and that is unusual, but these practices are happening. People are curious. You've got the emergence of universities in the Middle Ages. It's a medieval invention. We've all been to a university, that are spreading knowledge and that are teaching sort of, new ways of thinking. I really hate the idea that we think of it as backwards because it's just different from our worldview. If you look at it with a medieval hat on, and you're like, well, these are my worldviews, this is how the world works, then it's progress, because you're enhancing your understanding. If we look at it from a 21st century point of view, we know that certain things are not going to work. However, other things do. Often with lots of illnesses, you will be asked for a urine sample. They did a lot of that in the Middle Ages. Things like using honey if you have a sore throat. Again, that's something we still do today. The minute I get a sore throat, I have a hot water with honey and lemon. So I think we really need to just shift our mindset. And and this is true for any period of history. It's so easy to stand here in 2021 and go, oh, why on earth did they think that? You have to kind of undo all of your modern preconceptions and think of it in terms of development within the scope of the medieval world. And we know that there are lots of these, medical tracts that are being circulated. People are sort of increasing their understanding of the human body, but it's not in a way that we would sort of recognize as scientific development today, like, developing a vaccine or whatever. But, people were aware of things like, to help your digestion, don't eat too much and go for a regular walk. So I would really kind of, I'm not a fan of thinking of it as halting or being backwards. Definitely.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that's really pertinent, isn't it? Especially for those of us that do teach medicine through time, perhaps. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. So massive apologies to all those who have got questions that will be left unanswered. But perhaps if you tweet Dr. Claire Kennan afterwards, yeah, I'm sure she'd be happy to answer your questions. So please do that. So a question that has come in from Laura. You mentioned that the Reformation meant leaving the idea of purgatory behind to a degree. What's the effects of this on parishes, or perhaps to daily life in general? So
parishes are basically restructured after the Reformation. So that whole kind of structure of the guilds and everything else, and the Chantry chapels, all of that goes. And people are basically asked to change overnight. There is some sort of flip-flopping throughout the various Tudor period as we go back and forth between things, but really, under Edward VI, it's all removed. And the impact is huge, because as I've said, if this is a system of belief that's been in place for a long time, and it's regulated your daily life and the life of your ancestors, then you're not going to suddenly stop believing overnight. That's a tall ask. But officially, people were no longer allowed to belong to parish guilds and to pray as a group for the benefit of the souls of the deceased. They were no longer allowed to found these chantry chapels. So it all stops. But what parish guilds do, which is quite interesting, is, you know, and this is where we see the emergence of the craft guild. And I think, you know, whenever I say guild, that's what people think of instantly. They're like, oh yes, the guild of bakers. And those kind of tend to develop much later and more quickly in urban areas where you've got concentrations of specific crafts. Because the way that you didn't get dissolved as a guild in the Reformation was by not having this religious component. And some guilds are actually quite ahead of the game, and they get rid of all of the lands and things they've been endowed and they put them somewhere else. And, you know, I've got a few interesting examples of that. So the structures have to adapt. And, you know, people do, on the whole, they change and they abide by the new rules. But you do have pockets of discontent. And I saw somewhere in the question someone asking about, you know, the Northern rebellions. And that is definitely a moment of discontent. So the Lincolnshire Rising, which sort of, you know, happens just before the Pilgrimage of Grace, that doesn't kick off because of the dissolution of the monasteries. That kicks off because the people of the town have heard a rumour that their parish church is under threat. You know, that wonderful parish church I've been talking about that has the tall spire. They actually believe that Henry's commissioners are on the way to remove all of their surplus priests. They've got about 10 additional priests in the town, to take all of the gifts that have been given there and all the treasure, and to destroy the church. And that's what kicks that off. So, you know, people do react and rebel against it, but also you have to remember that people are sensible. You're not going to go up against a decision the king has made, because that will mark you out as a traitor. And we all know about the horrible deaths that were given out to traitors in the Middle Ages. So what's really difficult is to know how people handled it on an emotional and a psychological level, because obviously we can't go back and ask them. And I think that's a really interesting, you know, thing to think about. It's like with the Black Death as well, you know, how did people handle that emotionally? You know, we all talk about our mental health in this pandemic. Well, how did people manage those huge changes back then? And I think that's when you need to think really about the human element in history, and the fact that the records aren't going to give us the full view. But, you know, just because ordinary people didn't write in a diary or pop it on Instagram doesn't mean that they weren't experiencing those difficulties. And of course, the sudden removal of purgatory is going to be huge for people. As I said earlier, what are you going to do with like your dad's soul that's been stuck there for 30 years? It's not just suddenly going to disappear, is it? That's going to weigh heavily on people's minds. So yeah.
I think that speaks really well to a question we haven't managed to get to, but Kieran's question about why they went along with it, and perhaps, you know, they didn't everywhere, I suppose, is the answer.
I mean, you wouldn't really have much choice, would you? Let's be honest. We all know what Tudor kings were like. You're not gonna mess with them a lot of the time.
I think we've overrun again. Apologies. But a nice question to end on that I've been saving. Another one of Oliver's questions, and thank you so much for putting these questions in. Would you say that the parish church was more characterized by the fear of purgatory or the joy of communal feasts?
Oh, that's difficult. I reckon a bit of both. I think it's a bit of carrot and stick, you know, because that's usually what works to motivate people, isn't it? Like, I mean, yes, the fear of purgatory is always there, but people loved the feasting and the processions. There was such joy in that. I think I like to think a bit of both. I mean, I wish I could go back and ask someone, you know, but no, I do think it is a bit of both. And those moments were highlights for people. It really was. And it brought the community together. And yeah, so no, I think a bit of both. That would be my answer.
Really hope you enjoyed this recording. Before you go, please just do us one really quick favour and just click subscribe to our YouTube channel. We know it's a chore, but it's going to make such a huge difference to the network as we try to grow. Thank you.